Thank you, Professor Brint, for joining me on the podcast. We are talking about a really interesting subject today. Student loan debt is something that we've actually discussed on the podcast before, but obviously, given the news of Biden's plan, there's been a lot of updates, and I think a lot of people have questions on exactly not only what the plan entails and what it's going to do, but also the impacts of it. And so to get our conversation started, I thought maybe we should start kind of broad. Given the fact that the debt crisis, the student debt crisis, is such an expansive issue, and it impacts so many Americans, how far, in your opinion, do you think Biden's plan goes in terms of addressing the major concerns that Americans with loan debt have?
Well, the best thing to do, I think, is first to, for those who don't know, lay out a little bit about what the plan entails. The plan allows for up to $10,000 in loan forgiveness. As far as I know, students must apply and show that they are eligible. It also allows, in addition, another $10,000 or $20,000 in total for students who have received Pell Grants while attending college. There is an income cap on the program, so that those who earn more than $125,000 are not eligible. So we do have about 45 million Americans who have student loan debt. That is, that's a sizable proportion of adults, maybe a quarter or maybe a fifth of all adults. So there are many people who went to college who paid off their loans, if they had loans, many who didn't take loans out. And then, of course, many people who didn't attend college. So there were a variety of proposals before this one was finally decided on. Some of the listeners may remember that Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed $50,000 in student loan debt cancellation, and there have been a variety of other proposals between that level and the level that Biden finally settled on. If you are asking me about my views about this, I think you'll find that they are somewhat heterodox insofar as I have some hesitations about some features of this program. I certainly think that there are people who need and deserve loan forgiveness. I also think that the Sanders idea and the Warren idea was extremely regressive, in the sense that the people who would benefit from it would be primarily upper income people. So the Biden plan, although it has flaws, is certainly preferable from my point of view. And I think it's good that he has a cap on income, so that it is more targeted towards people who are not high earners. There's still some flaws in it. Some of the people will eventually be high earners. And so a case could be made for graduating the loan forgiveness by age, so that the income cap is lower for younger people and higher for older people. But there are groups that have definitely struggled in recent years, and this plan will certainly ease their burden. I think the people that are most deserving of this kind of loan forgiveness are those who took out loans to attend for-profit institutions where the practices were predatory in the sense that they sell very hard, taking out as many loans as you possibly can. And then they very often, many of them just do not deliver in terms of jobs coming out. There are also those who are very unlikely to realize economic benefits that most college students do realize. So if you, for example, major in a field like social work or child development, you attend a second or third tier open access institution. And also, if you're from a marginalized population group, because there is still discrimination in the labor market, your chances of benefiting economically from college are lower. And there are quite a few people in that category. And that's a real soft spot in our college. Now, you could still benefit in many ways from college. Your mind could be expanded, the people that you know could be expanded. But if you're just talking about it economically, there are some soft spots, and they're related to major, they're related to the institution you attend, and they're related to the population group. I think also those from lower income backgrounds who never completed a degree, regardless of their major and regardless of whether they're, which racial ethnic group they're from, a case can be made that they also merit this kind of relief. But that is a subset of the people who this program will benefit. And of course, there'll be a lot of people, even who aren't in those groups, who will be happy for the relief, and it will help them get a start, a better start in life. It's a little trickier for people that are outside of that group, because it is still the case that a college education brings many benefits relative to high school, let's say, or even an associate's degree. So the average male who completes college, I think the advantage is still at least 850,000 or 900,000 over the course of a working lifetime, relative to a high school graduate who's male. And for women, the gap is lower, but I think last time I looked at it was $650,000 over a working lifetime. So, college graduates certainly on average have a huge benefit over those who don't attend college. And a pretty strong case could be made that those who never attend college or drop out, let's say after a semester before they've have much debt, they're the ones who typically are really struggling in our society. And they're the ones who really, need maybe some additional help from government. But and so I do feel that for all the benefits that this program brings, it does leave out a lot of people who are struggling economically in American society, and they may have cause for feeling like they've been ignored by this program.
Definitely. I think, there's been a lot of talk around not only the specific program itself, but also, does it actually address the main concerns that exist? And, hearing you speak about how important college is, and the benefits that people take away from it makes me, turn to the idea that this is more of a Band-Aid type solution than really addressing the core issue, which seems to be, or at least for most people, seems to be the fact that tuition and general costs have risen so much faster than inflation rates have. And so when when those costs have increased so much, then I can somewhat understand why some people are viewing this as not necessarily a negative, a negative idea, but more so that it's not really addressing the main issue. Do you think that, do you agree with that sentiment, the idea that this is more of a band-aid solution and it doesn't really tackle the core? And maybe, limiting college tuition is also not the solution. I think that one something I've found out, recently in these past few weeks is the idea that being narrow-minded about this is not a good approach, because there are so many factors to consider, and other things that we'll probably talk about later on as well, like inflation, are also things that have been discussed. So do you feel that sentiment is accurate, or maybe there's
Yeah, I do, Kevin. I do sympathize with that view, and I do agree with it, and I'm glad you brought it up. Um, we have to realize, first of all, that kids who are in high school now or junior high school, this policy is not going to affect them at all. And uh, so we're not looking towards the future here. We're looking towards the past. And I think that you're 100% on target to say that the big problem is that we have increasing college costs. And that is putting some colleges out of reach for some students, and is also making it difficult for other students to attend. And so the problem with college costs is extremely complicated, as you've alluded to. I'm going to go into a little bit of a discussion about college costs, because they are the root, and this policy does not address college costs. So I'm not sure I would characterize it as a band-aid, but I do feel that it doesn't get at the root. And so, why have we seen costs go up? Partly, this is how complicated it is. Partly, as these institutions grow larger, they need more staff. Like, you need more accountants, you need more police, you need more people, maintenance people, just to do the basics around the campus. You have a lot more regulation of universities, and that regulatory costs also leads to more staff. Students themselves demand campuses look a certain way, or they might not attend. So they want state-of-the-art dorms, state-of-the-art recreation centers. And so in some ways, student demand also drives college costs. We found that in order to help students get through college, we need more student services staff, more people in academic resources centers, more tutors, and also more advisors. Partly that's because we've made graduation a big priority, which I think is highly warranted. And partly because students, maybe their academic skills in some cases are not, and their ability to navigate the institution are not at the highest level. And so then on top of that, we have undoubtedly some empire building among university administrators. So you can always think of new programs that you want to do and you feel would be beneficial for students. And sometimes you can get those programs, get them instituted, but then it adds to the cost. In the public institutions, college has become what some people call a balance wheel in the state budget. So there are a lot of fixed costs in the state budget for K-12 education, for medical, um, and for prisons, for example, where they feel like fixed costs because there's no other source of income for a prison or for K-12 schools. Whereas universities do have another source of revenue, and that is tuition. So what tends to happen is when times are tough, when there's a recession, higher ed gets cut because the other obligations are just the governors and legislators don't know what to do about them. They can't cut them very much. And then, of course, universities will add tuition dollars. And so then when times are good, there is some restoration by the state of funding, but typically it doesn't go back to where it was before. And so those tuition increases tend to get locked in. And not all, I don't, it's really tough to know what to do about this situation. Most of it is driven by administrative costs, and a lot of those administrative costs are legit or can't, they're legitimate in the sense that we can't just wish away regulatory controls. We can't just wish away the need for another accountant when the university grows, and that sort of thing. But there is this idea among higher ed scholars that there's administrative bloat, that most of the increase is due to administrative staff, and maybe there would be a way to reduce the administrative staff. It's not by and large from the teaching staff, the faculty. And in fact, there's been a huge replacement of faculty by low-cost labor, by lecturers, and they are not paid well by and large. And they are now nationally, there are more than 50% of the teaching faculty are not tenured and not tenure track. So there's been a huge effort to try to reduce the teaching costs, probably to the disadvantage of students overall. But of course, there are some great lecturers who are, in spite of being paid poorly, are still tremendous, in what they do in the classroom. But it's a dilemma. I mean, there's just a big dilemma here about what to do with college costs. And of course, the college costs are lower in the publics than they are in the privates. And we don't worry about the privates as much, but some of them also have huge problems, which we could go into. But all I'm saying here is the cost problem is not an easy one to fix. And so people tend to look at financial aid reforms, and to make it, easier to attend, even if we can't reduce the cost too much. And so, we talk about things like doubling Pell Grants, the size of Pell Grants, which I've advocated and many, many other people have, and moving to a comprehensive loan system where all loans are income contingent or income driven, so that you pay less when your income is lower and you pay more when your income is higher. We have already this system in the United States, and about a quarter of borrowers take advantage of it, but it is a lot of red tape. You have to show every year your income based on the IRS. There's a lot of, filings, and it trips up a lot of people, and a lot of people end up not being able to comply. And then maybe some of them also feel like they have complied, and then they go into default. And so that, there's problems with that program, and we'd have to fix those problems before it became something you can easily advocate. But a lot of countries do have income-driven loan repayment. England is one of them, and there are others, many others, at least 9 that I know of. And so it seems like that would be something else we can do. If we can't reduce costs and keep costs low, we should do what we can in that area. But if we can't do that much, at least we can reform financial aid so that it's less onerous, less of a burden on students.
Definitely. I think the picture you painted about the complexities about the cost of college and why costs have increased, it really made me feel like there is no single blanket solution to this issue. And that's going to take a creative approach to actually addressing it. One thing I also want to circle back to, coming back to the main topic, is the other issues surrounding Biden's plan that have been brought up. And one of them is about inflation. I know there has been heated debate around whether or not the impact of this is actually going to be good in the long run. I know opponents of Biden's plan and critics have brought up I've seen some numbers stating that the plan could cost upwards of $500 billion, and that the impact on inflation, after the administration just passed an inflation plan. But I've also seen proponents and supporters of the policy claim that the impact would be negligible, because 10,000 per person isn't that much, and that eventually people will still be paying back. It's not a full cancellation. I know it's the economics in this aspect, it's a little bit difficult to predict, but what are your thoughts on the potential impact this might have on the country beyond just individuals, loan requirements?
Yeah. Okay. It's another important issue, and I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not well positioned to speak at length about that. I did worry about it. It's one of the things that's a little bothersome, honestly, about this policy is that nobody really has a firm estimate of the costs. And so you see cost figures anywhere from around 200 million to the figure that you quoted, $500 billion. I've seen cost estimates even higher than that. And so we just don't know how much it's going to cost. And regardless of what the effect is on inflation, and there is, like you say, there's heated debate about that. And I guess my concerns have been alleviated somewhat by reading people like Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate economist, who has run the numbers and feels that the effect on inflation is likely to be negligible. But even holding that issue aside, we have to say, well, somebody is going to be paying for this, and what's going to happen is there isn't, unlike the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, there's no revenue stream that's associated with this policy. So it's an expenditure without a clear revenue stream. Now, I know the Biden administration has said, well, this year it's taken care of by how much deficit reduction we're doing through the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll see whether that turns out to be true or not. But in subsequent years, it's unknown. So it's probably the case that it will add to the deficit. So it replaces one kind of borrowing, in a sense, with another kind of borrowing. And the American taxpayers are going to be paying at least the interest on the national debt, right? And however much this adds to the national debt. So, maybe that's a trade-off we want to make in order to help people are struggling with their student loans. I can certainly sympathize with that as a trade-off that we want to make, but it would be wrong to think that there's no cost here to anyone, that it's just a benefit. That's not true. And the larger it costs, I mean, if it is closer, let's say, to $500 billion than to 200 million, then the pain is higher to the taxpayer, right? So um, I'm not going to comment on the effect for inflation. I just, I'm not an economist, and so I don't feel I have the expertise to comment on that. But I will say that it's a bit of a concern to me that we have such wildly different estimates on how much this program is going to cost, just in general, and then for taxpayers who are paying the interest on the national debt. We don't know, and we won't know. And the Biden administration honestly has not done a terrific job of convincing people. I mean, I think people who are independent of the administration, their lowest figures are 350 million that I've seen. So it's, it's not a drop in the bucket. But again, I want to emphasize that this may be a trade-off that you were prepared to make. And obviously the administration is prepared to make it. And obviously the critics of the administration are trying to hammer the administration over this program. We haven't gotten into the politics of this, which is another important topic. And I wonder whether you wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question was your thoughts on the politics of it. I know, again, back to the heated debate, there has been some talk that that this policy was at least somewhat politically motivated. Midterms are coming up. What are your thoughts on that? It's also a really interesting a subject within.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about this policy, and I'm not saying it's necessarily the best way, but that it's part social welfare program for people who are struggling to make ends meet, partly a middle class benefit for people who maybe are not struggling quite as much, but nevertheless will appreciate the relief that this program offers, and partly a kind of pork barrel that is intended to make the party, the Democratic Party, look good to constituency groups it depends on. It's to the extent that it is pork barrel politics, and it's different than having a new government building located in West Virginia, or it's a much bigger pork barrel than that. But I'm one of those who feels that this is partly, at least, politically motivated. Definitely younger people tend more often to be enthusiastic about the Democratic Party, but they also don't vote as much as older people. And highly educated people are a huge constituency of the Democratic Party at this point. The parties have kind of flipped now, so that less educated blue collar workers are more likely to identify as Republicans, and highly educated white collar or knowledge workers, as some people say, are much more likely to identify as Democrats. So you've got a couple of constituency groups also, and to the extent that people who take out Pell Grants tend to be more often people of color. That's another Democratic constituency group. So how, regardless of how well targeted the program is in terms of need, it is pretty well targeted to Democratic constituency groups. And I think we have to remember that this is a campaign promise that Biden made while he was running for president. And that, whether or not that was an ill-considered campaign promise, and I'm not prepared to say that it was, but he's following through. And basically, people like politicians who follow through on their campaign promises. But there is no doubt in my mind that this is partly to energize the Democratic constituency groups, some of whom do not vote as much as Democrats would hope that they vote. And so maybe this will do the trick. I think the other side of this, and there is another side of it politically, is the people who, and definitely the Republicans, are trying to hammer this, and even some moderate Democrats are worried about it. The people who never attended college, didn't accumulate a lot of debt, or did accumulate some debt and then paid it off, and feel like, why are we giving a handout, quote unquote, to people who are, didn't do what we did, which was make sacrifices and pay back the debts that they acquired. So there's going to be some political messaging around that. And the question in my mind is, will it matter, to on either side? Are people really going to vote based on this policy, or is it, or other things foremost in their minds? Is abortion, for example, foremost in their minds, or is inflation foremost in their minds, and or is the threat to American democracy, which some polls are showing now is a big issue for many people in the country, will that be foremost in their minds? And will those things both push turnout and also the particular party that is favored? I guess it seems to me at this moment that the loan forgiveness program is unlikely to be the priority issue that people vote on, and so it might end up being a wash politically, that it'll stimulate some people to vote, but it also maybe stimulates some people who don't like it to, reinforce their desire to vote on the other side. I think the Biden administration is hoping, and they might be right about this, that it's going to have a positive impact on younger people who, really it's hard to get to the polls, more than it has a negative impact on people who don't like it. I mean, there's some indications already that there are the people who don't benefit this are not as negatively disposed as the people who do benefit from it are positively disposed for it. And many people, I guess, just feel like they don't care that much if there's a benefit to people who have student loans, even if they don't have them. So there's a little bit of polling data that suggests that my initial worries about how the politics of this would play out, and I guess I wouldn't say worries, but my sort of sense that this might not play out politically the way the Biden administration was hoping, might be wrong. On the other hand, we do have people like Tim Ryan, for example, who is in a tight race in a kind of red leaning state, who is saying he's worried about this and the impact of this for for people who um, are hardworking, working class people who deserve deserve help from the government and aren't getting it, while college students whose prospects in life tend to be a little better are getting it. And he's distancing himself, as are some other people who are in tough races in purple or red leaning states, and you can sort of understand why that would be an option for them. Does that
Definitely.
make sense?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely did. I think the politics is super interesting just because, um, what you mentioned earlier, that it most likely is at least partially politically motivated, but also it was a campaign promise, and a lot of people tend to forget that. And you also mentioned how, most people who, really like when politicians actually follow through. And so there's just so much back and forth on whether it is politically motivated. And like you said, it might end up being a wash. So much has happened recently that could influence the election, and this just might not end up being the deciding factor, or who knows, maybe it might be one of the main factors. It's just so hard to predict, especially when there's so much conversation, and also how people frame, depending on where they land, on the political spectrum, the way they frame the issue. I know there are some people who think that this isn't enough. They prefer what you mentioned at the beginning, Senator Sanders and Warren, when they were talking about forgetting 50,000, and that's what they wanted, and so they might also not really be a fan of this.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Kevin. And I hadn't thought of that one, but that's possible. That's also possible. So it'll be interesting to see. The post-election polling on this will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a really interesting next couple of months leading up to the election. As we approach the end of the episode, I did want to ask one more question, maybe a little bit broader in nature. Looking to the future, you mentioned earlier that this doesn't really impact current high school students, and for many, this isn't really going to change their lives that much. There are some people who have accumulated significantly more amount of debt, and this isn't really going to impact them that much. Looking towards the future, I know we talked about some other policy options like doubling the Pell Grant was something you mentioned. Do you think when this issue comes eventually, inevitably comes back, do you think that this kind of cancellation is going to be the approach that an administration may take, or do you think maybe this policy or this program doesn't have the intended effect, or doesn't go as far as people want it to go, and that's when they might look at other options? You mentioned loan repayment plans based on income. Do you think those ideas might get increased interest in the future, or do you think this cancellation just might become a regular thing every now and then? What are your thoughts looking forward beyond?
Well, yeah, it's not. Well, if there's a Republican administration, of course it's not. But yeah, so one of the concerns that people have raised is what happens if current high school students see this program and say, well, the government will probably just cancel some of my loans. And that leads them to take out more loans, maybe even loans that they don't really completely need. And then the government, for whatever reason, maybe that's the other party in power, or people get into a deficit hawk mode of thinking, doesn't cancel loans. Another sort of nightmare scenario type of thing is, what if universities say, well, the government is going to come and cancel loans every so often, and so we can just charge more tuition because the loans that students take out will eventually be canceled and assumed by the government. There's we don't know. This is called moral hazard in the literature, and when a policy leads to potentially negative behavior on the assumption that that policy might be come into effect again later. As you say, it could be the case that the government would come back and cancel loans in the future, but that's unpredictable. And in the meantime, if it influences behavior in a way that could be contrary to the interests of students or too much in the interests of universities, I guess there would be some room for concern there. And I do not believe that those are fanciful necessarily scenarios. I call them nightmare scenarios, but I don't think they're completely fanciful. I think we see some evidence of that kind of behavior on the part of both students and universities. So I think we have to worry about that. And I think that really goes back to something we were talking about earlier. What we really need to do is try to fix the cost problem or the affordability problem. And on the side of controlling costs, I see real limits there. I mean, there have been universities that have saved tens of millions of dollars, but what they do with those savings is tend to put it into new programs or deferred maintenance or things that they feel, are necessary to improve their product, so to speak. And so even where you get cost savings, it doesn't necessarily lead to lower tuition or lower, long-term costs. And that's why I think we need to keep pressure on that. I really think that there are real savings that we can look for. But I guess when I've looked at this, it doesn't look to me like the long-term solution. And what looks to me more like the long-term solution is financial aid reforms, the kinds of financial aid reforms that we've talked about, doubling Pell Grants, making all loans income driven or income contingent, and moving in that direction so that regardless of what happens with cancellation in the future, we have a system that is more sustainable than the one that we currently have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Brint, for simplifying such a complex issue. There are so many moving parts to this, so many various kinds of conversations going on, most of which are very heated. And so it's really interesting coming from an expert, kind of digging through the sand and really figuring out, which major points we need to focus on. And I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need to address the cost issue. And that's something that is a conversation that needs to happen more often. And I think that our viewers will really appreciate that sentiment. So thank you, Professor Brint, for joining us.
Kevin, thank you for inviting me onto the program. And I think it's been a very interesting conversation and very good questions. So I hope everyone enjoys it.